Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and it appears that the longest government shutdown in American history is coming to an end. On Sunday night, 8 members of the Senate Democratic Caucus joined Republicans in advancing a deal that would fund the government through January. It would also fund programs related to agriculture, military construction, and the legislative branch for most of 2026. What Democrats got in return is a promise to vote on the enhanced Obamacare subsidies in December, a reversal of government layoffs made during the shutdown, continued funding of the Government Accountability Office, and maintaining the office's ability to sue the Trump administration. All 8 of the senators who voted with Republicans are not up for re-election in 2026, and Democratic leadership criticized the deal along with plenty of other Democratic lawmakers. As of the time we're recording this, the budget still has to make its way through the Senate, pass the House, and be signed by President Trump. That's a story we're going to begin with today, and we're also going to dig into more takeaways from last week's elections and news from the Supreme Court. The tariff case is mainly what we're going to focus on, but the court made some news this morning as we were getting ready to record on the same-sex marriage challenge and mail-in balloting, so we'll get into some of that. And here with me to do all of it is Gabe Fleischer, author of the Wake Up to Politics newsletter and friend of the podcast. Gabe, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, Gabe. So the question of the hour. According to recent polling, Americans blame President Trump and Republicans more than they blame Democrats for the shutdown by a double-digit margin. Around 70% of Americans support an extension of the Obamacare subsidies, and even after the longest shutdown in history, with workers going without pay, threats to SNAP benefits, and snarled travel, in a recent KFF poll, about 50% of Americans still said Democrats should hold out until their demands are met. Add to that by every measure, Democrats had a great election night last week, and Trump is facing just about his lowest approval rating of his second term. So, why is now the moment that Democrats are folding on the shutdown?
It's a good question, and I don't think it's 100% clear. I think, as you said, I think we've gone through about 41 days of this, and I think there were points where it seemed like, a deal was kind of right in the offing. There was points where it seemed like the two sides were very far apart. I think just in the last week, we kind of had both of those, where right before last Tuesday's elections, it seemed like a deal was like right on the verge of happening. Then the elections happened, and for a moment, it kind of seemed like everything had collapsed. And then obviously the talks kind of seemed to have picked up right back again after a few days. I think it's not 100% clear. I think, from the perspective of the Democratic senators who, agreed to this compromise, I think one turning point does seem to have been President Trump. Basically, he has, as you said, Democrats are blaming, the public are blaming Republicans more than the Democrats for the shutdown. And even Donald Trump seems to have accepted that. He seems to be saying pretty openly, we're getting the blame for this. But even after he's made that realization, his next move was not to say, okay, we should negotiate on healthcare. Instead, he was saying we should eliminate the filibuster. So I think it became pretty clear, even to these moderate Democratic senators, that even with President Trump accepting that the public was blaming him, there was still no deal to be had on Obamacare. And I think that was kind of the crucial turning point, was this finding that, the shutdown could go on 40 days, 50 days, 60 days, go on for the rest of the year, and still there was no sign that there would ever be a healthcare deal that would come out of the shutdown. And so I think some moderate Democrats kind of ran the calculation, how willing are they to subject, the public to the pain of, Thanksgiving travel delays, continued uncertainty around food stamps, if there was just no sign that they were ever going to get their kind of core demand.
Yeah, so lots of takes are being published this morning. One from Matt Iglesias is that you can only understand this if you understand this through the lens of the filibuster. And in fact, you can't even just understand this through the lens of, moderate Democrats caving or something like that, because there are a lot of moderate Democrats who are criticizing this deal. It's more the institutionalists, the folks who really value the filibuster and the power that the filibuster grants to, in particular, the more moderate or institutionalists or even just individual senators in general. So we've been all focusing on the Obamacare subsidies. But is this more about the filibuster than anything else?
I don't think it's more about the filibuster. The way I put it in my newsletter is I think there are essentially 2 different ways, or I guess 3 different ways this could have ended. Obviously, the Democratic best case scenario was that Obamacare subsidy, the enhanced Obamacare subsidies would be extended. there are not the votes for that in the House or Senate, or at the very least, there is not, the will on the part of the leaders who control the floor calendars to have that happen in the House and Senate. Then Donald Trump's best case scenario was that the filibuster be eliminated, which obviously unlocks the ability for him to achieve a whole host of, different legislative priorities. There are not the votes for that in the Senate. And so I think in some ways, maybe that makes it about the filibuster, but just the reality is neither the Democratic plan or the Trump plan to end the shutdown really had the votes. And so therefore you end with this kind of middle ground that I think was always kind of the most likely end game. I think we talked about this being the most likely endgame a few weeks ago, being this kind of middle ground where Democrats cave and accept kind of a vote on Obamacare subsidies. I think, I have to admit, I've been a little confused by seeing, I've seen people like Matt Iglesias. I think, there's a lot of Democrats that were secretly hoping this would lead to the end of the filibuster. I don't really understand that, to be honest, from a Democratic perspective. I think, Donald Trump is right that, there is no benefit in being the second party to be under, post-filibuster control. That's his whole reason why he wants Republicans to eliminate the filibuster now. By the same token, I don't really think it helps Democrats much for Republicans to have ended the filibuster. I still think it's probably likely they're going to do it in their next trifecta. So why have, this period of Republican policy achievements, which Trump is absolutely right. There's a whole host of policy achievements that he cannot do now that would happen under the filibuster, that many of which the Democrats would really not like to see, and many of which I think the Democrats are kind of deluding themselves would actually be quite popular and quite difficult to undo. Voter ID being one example of something that polls really well that Trump has talked about doing without the filibuster. So I think that is maybe to some degree what Democrats were kind of hoping would happen here, but I don't think ultimately they would have been served by that endgame either.
Okay, so here is a different take from Tim Miller of The Bulwark, and he's claiming that Dems won the shutdown fight and acknowledges that this may be one of his most controversial takes. So he said, this fold won't matter at all in next year's midterms, but making the GOP own the dogshit big beautiful bill / tariff / healthcare policies will. This is not an example of Dems not fighting like Republicans. It's a longer shutdown than anything the kamikaze Tea Party ever did. The people who are mad about this are a small subset of the electorate that treat politics like sports, and it's possible that their crying about the fold will contribute to snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. There was no path to getting the Obamacare subsidies back because the GOP controls everything and was never going to do it, and they are fake populists. Dems should run against them on that topic, and they have a great case study now. MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, helps them with that. The fact that there was no getting Obamacare subsidy extensions endgame was obvious at the start, and anyone setting that expectation was lying to people ratio away. Do you agree with that?